On the night Jean Virginia Sampare walked out of her family home in Gitsagukla, British Columbia, she carried more than the uncertain weight of an argument or a broken heart. She carried a history the rest of her family could never shake. She was 18. Her name at home was Ginny. People who loved her remember a quiet, steady girl who looked after her younger siblings and kept to herself in ways that made her disappearance feel impossible to them. She would not simply vanish without a trace. The facts, as recorded in police reports, community testimony, and later public hearings, are spare and sharp. On October 14, 1971, she left the house and was last seen near a railroad overpass on Highway 16, outside the small reserve village of Gitsagukla. Her cousin Alvin was with her. He walked away for a moment to get a jacket or a bike, and by the time he returned, she was gone. He later said he heard a car door slam right before he saw that she had vanished. That moment, ordinary, careless, and then forever altered, became the hinge on which a family's life turned and turned again, seeking answers that have not come. Gitsagukla sits in the Skeena Valley, a place of rivers and mountains, of salmon runs and long winters. In 1971, it was a small community in traditional Gitxsan territory. Families lived close, and relationships were tangled with both love and old pain. Ginny grew up there as the second youngest of 6 children. Her family remembers a girl who protected her siblings when their father drank, who went to high school in the nearby town of Hazleton, and who worked at a salmon canning plant in Claxton. She had plans, small, plausible plans, like moving to Terrace with a younger brother, Rod, later that month. None of those plans included disappearing into the night. The record says she had been upset earlier that evening, and that an argument with her mother may have prompted her to step outside. Her sister-in-law, Violet, said she saw Ginny at the family home between 10 and 11 in the evening. Ginny looked like she had been crying, then walked out the door. Those are simple human moments. A knock of anger and hurt, somebody stepping into the cold air to breathe. They are also the last confirmed points on a timeline that from that hour onward becomes blank. The immediate hours after Ginny failed to return to the house were a blur of worry and slow-moving procedure. Her mother reported her missing the next morning to the band office in Gitsagukla. For reasons that still sting in memories, someone at the band office told the family there had to be a waiting period before contacting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. In truth, no law required such a wait. This was a delay that cost precious hours. The band office did send people out to check with relatives in nearby communities, South Hazleton, Kitimat, places where Ginny's sisters might have been staying, but they found nothing. It was only on October 16th that the RCMP formally took a missing person S report from Ginny S' mother. Following that report, searches were organized. Neighbors and volunteers combed dense brush, civil defense personnel joined the efforts, and a helicopter was brought in on October 27th to look at the terrain from the air. After 2 weeks, on October 28th, the official search was called off. For the family, calling off the search did not end the search for answers. It only made the gap wider. There are threads in this story that lead into larger, darker patterns in British Columbia's past. Threads that are part of what people now talk about as the Highway of Tears. That stretch of Highway 16 would, in later decades, be associated with a long list of Indigenous women and girls who went missing or were murdered along or near it. Ginny's disappearance came in that early, unsettled list. Within months and years of other disappearances in the north, her case sits among a cluster of tragedies that would eventually be seen together, not because they all reveal the same culprit, but because they expose the same vulnerability. Young Indigenous women alone near isolated roads, towns where policing was distant and responses were uneven, families left to pick up tiny, painful clues. Recognizing those patterns helps us understand Why Ginny's disappearance has continued to hold the attention of communities and advocates fighting for justice. But recognizing patterns does not answer for the person who was in that cold light on October night, or for the family who has had to live with unanswered questions for decades. When someone disappears, the mind divides the world into possibilities. For Ginny, people tried to make sense of three main routes the truth might have taken: suicide, runaway, or foul play. Her parents asserted that suicide was not consistent with who Ginny was. Her family said she was not a runaway. She had no history of running away, and she left her jacket at home on a cold night, details that suggest she did not intend to be outside for long. The cousin Alvin's account of a car door slamming gives weight to the idea of foul play, an approaching vehicle, and the sudden disappearance of a young woman where her cousin had last seen her. But weight is not proof, and for over half a century the authorities have not produced conclusive evidence to name the cause. When the RCMP first recorded the case, there were searches and interviews, but no capture of what really happened. The story is full of what could be and full of what never was found. More than a decade and a half after the disappearance, in the mid-1980s, the RCMP reported to Ginny's younger brother Rod that the file had been closed. According to what Rod was told, a 1971 report from the Gitsagukla band's chief counselor had suggested that Ginny had drowned. Yet there was no conclusive evidence to support such a claim. The terrain nearby includes rivers and tributaries, but nothing was found to point definitively to drowning. The family pushed back, asked for records, asked for the file, but Rod reports being refused when he requested the complete missing persons file from the RCMP. There was another action decades later. Around 2006, authorities took DNA from Ginny's siblings, reportedly as part of wider investigations into serial offenders, including the Robert Picton inquiry. Those samples, too, have not been publicly linked to any breakthrough in Ginny's case. Each official decision, the closing and later partial reopening of the file, the taking of DNA samples, the refusal to release full records, reads to the family like a sequence of doors shut rather than doors opened. Families carry certain kinds of grief that cannot be reduced to raw statistics. They carry memory, the way Ginny smiled, how she sat at the table, the weight of her jacket when it sat unused on a hook at home. Her brother Rod would later tell public hearings that the family felt the weight of inattention, that the disappearance did not receive the full force of the investigation it deserved. In 2009, and again in years afterward, Rod and sisters like Winnie spoke to journalists, pleading for the case to be treated with the seriousness it required. They wanted what every family wants when the timeline of someone's life stops mid-sentence: an answer, so that the story could move from not knowing to knowing, even if the knowing is its own grief. Those public appeals, interviews in newspapers, testimonies at a national inquiry, did not invent facts. They insisted attention be paid to facts already recorded and to the family's lived experience of loss. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, convened by the Government of Canada years later, created a formal space where families like the Sampares could speak publicly about what had happened and about how they had been treated. In September 2017, Rod and other family members gave testimony in Smithers as part of the inquiry's truth-gathering process. Those hearings are a rare archival record, the voice of family members under oath, the specifics of a small community made visible to the nation. They testified not to sensationalize, but to explain how the absence had threaded through their lives. The way people left questions open in their home, the sense that authorities sometimes thought of Indigenous disappearances as less urgent. Those are painful claims, and they are specific. They contribute to a broader account of systemic neglect that the inquiry would later document across many cases. For the Sampare family, the inquiry was both a chance to be heard and a reminder that being heard does not equal getting answers. If you stand where Ginny was last seen on a late autumn evening near an overpass that carries a thin river of freight and small local vehicles, you can imagine the smells that might have been there. Diesel, wet leaves, the river a track of deeper sound. You can imagine the human scale of the place, not a crossroads of cities but a pause point between settlements, a place where people from small towns might gather to share news, to meet friends, or to wait for a ride. This is not speculation pulled from thin air. It is supported by the geography and culture documented in records from the region. Highway 16 through northern British Columbia connects sparse, spread-out communities separated by long distances, and sometimes limited transit. For young people without cars, hitching rides or walking to a store were normal. That normal vulnerability becomes a central fact in the cases that formed the pattern later called Highway of Tears. Isolation, limited public transit, and a highway that can look like opportunity and like danger at the same time. For Ginny, these features of place were part of the context in which she vanished, and they are part of why her family, and many others, have insisted on the need for systemic change in how missing Indigenous women are investigated and how their families are supported. Over the years, people have tried to fill the blank in ways that sometimes comfort and sometimes wound. In the earliest months after Ginny disappeared, some in the community believed she might have drowned. The chief counselor's report from 1971 claimed as much, and that report later formed part of the RCMP's rationale when they closed the case in 1985. Yet drowning left no body, no trace. It was a conclusion drawn without the evidence that families and critics demand before closure. Other possibilities: abduction, a violent encounter, the intervention of someone who that night saw a frightened young woman alone and took advantage, remain plausible given what Alvin reported hearing. But plausibility is not proof. After so many years, what remains are family testimonies, police reports with redactions and refusals, and a public record that contains as many questions as it does statements. The truth feels stubbornly private, and stubbornly public at once. Private in what happened to Ginny that night, public in how the community and the state have treated the disappearance. In the absence of firm conclusions, memory does the work of keeping a person present. Ginny's family has done what families often do. They have become the custodians of her story. They kept photographs, talked about her at kitchen tables, and attended hearings where they told the world what had been lost. In interviews, their language is plain and human. They want to put their sister to rest. They want to stop living with the what-ifs, and they want a full accounting from authorities. When someone from the family stood to speak at the 2017 inquiry, they did not deliver a monologue of accusation for its own sake. They sought visibility and action. It is worth noting that in the decades since Ginny disappeared, the absence has not been treated as the same as closure. The band at one point listed her as deceased. After the family objected, her status was changed back to missing. That matter-of-fact correction is itself a kind of protest. To call someone dead without proof feels like an erasure to families who still hope for answers. Communities and advocates have, across the years, tried to change the conditions that make disappearances more likely and more painful. The stories of Highway 16 and the lives of women like Ginny have contributed to calls for more accessible public transit, for better cross-jurisdictional police coordination, for culturally safe investigative practices, and for the mandatory review of cold cases that may have been neglected. These are structural responses, not emotional cures. They cannot bring back a person or erase the missing years, but they aim to ensure that future disappearances do not get swallowed by delays, miscommunication, or indifference. The national inquiry highlighted systemic failures and called for such reforms. Those findings are part of the public record now, and they form a baseline from which Ginny's family and others can continue to demand accountability. When you listen to family testimony, Rod and Winnie and Violet, you hear practical details and quiet heartbreak in the same breath. They describe the night, the immediate checks with relatives, and the long wait for answers. They describe asking for the complete missing persons file and being denied. They describe the moment a conversation at the band office delayed the formal alert to the police. Each of those instances seems small on its own, a miscommunication, a misplaced assumption, a procedural mistake. Taken together, they build a picture of how a disappearance can be mishandled, and how an ordinary life can slip into an extraordinary absence without a corresponding extraordinary response. Families remember not only the person, but also how the absence was handled. In the Sampare case, that handling became part of the story they told the nation in 2017. There is a tendency in our collective imagination to turn missing person stories into single-solution mysteries. A clue unrolled, a detective who sees what everyone else missed, an arrest that ties threads together. Real life resists that tidy structure. In Ginny's case, there is no neatly packaged piece of evidence waiting in a box for someone to find. There are small traces. Alvin's recollection of a vehicle door slamming, the memory of a jacket left at home, the confirmation that her boyfriend, who had worked with her at the cannery, had disappeared earlier, and whose remains were later found in the Skeena River. Those are not puzzle pieces that always interlock. They are, instead, the raw materials of grief, fragments that suggest certain outcomes while refusing to deliver certainty. Families must live with that tension, and sometimes with the terrible possibility that we will never know. What keeps a case like Ginny's alive in the public mind? Part of it is her family's persistence, refusing to let her case fade into a list, and part of it is the wider pattern of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, which has created networks of support and advocacy that can keep older cases visible. Organizations, local journalists, and historians have compiled lists and stories, placing Ginny's name among many other women who vanished along the same stretch of road or within the same era. The internet has been a mixed blessing here. Forums and pages that collect cold cases help keep memories alive, but they also sometimes amplify speculation or present unverified claims as facts. That is why careful records, like the National Inquiry transcripts and documented interviews with family members, matter so much. They anchor the story to verifiable testimony rather than rumor. Those transcripts and interviews provide the solid ground from which families and advocates can say, this was real, this was someone's life, and we are still asking for answers. If you talk to people who grew up around Gitsagukla and Hazelton, you learn that the community's memories are communal and layered. In small towns, everyone remembers variations of the same event, each recollection shading the others. For the Sampare family, these community memories are both comfort and frustration. They comfort because they mean Ginny is not forgotten. People remember her as a person, not simply an item in a database. They frustrate because human memory is fallible. Different recollections can pull the story in different directions. That is why official records and community testimony must be read together. One to check the other, one to give shape, the other to keep it human. The 2017 public hearing gave the family a stage to combine both, a legal transcript that also carried the sound of a brother's voice trying to make sense of the past. As years passed, the context around such disappearances changed. Investigations into serial offenders in British Columbia, most notably the inquiry into Robert Picton, triggered renewed attention to cold cases and led to DNA collection from relatives of missing women. In Ginny's case, DNA from her siblings was reportedly taken around 2006. Families hoped such measures might finally connect a missing person to remains or to a perpetrator. Yet those efforts did not produce public leads in Ginny's case. The absence of publicly announced breakthroughs does not mean nothing happened behind the scenes. It simply means nothing that could be shared with the family or the public led to closure. When agencies say little, families remain suspended between a hope that something will turn up and the fear that nothing ever will. The idea of closure can be misleading. For some families, closure implies a neat resolution, a body found, a perpetrator convicted, a courtroom announcement. For others, closure is simply a name, a date, an acknowledgement that transforms the missing into the missing no longer only in their hearts, but in the public record. The Sampare family resisted the band's attempt to list Ginny as deceased precisely because to declare her dead without evidence would have been to finalize a story they still wanted to investigate. They understood that an administrative checkbox can erase investigative urgency, so they insisted on keeping her status listed as missing, a small, stubborn refusal to let the official world pretend the case had been solved. It is a human act, insisting that absence does not mean conclusion. There is an almost unbearable intimacy to the ways families narrate the last day they saw someone. They speak of the small things, the jacket left hanging, the way a sibling turned. For a moment, the sound of a car door. These details anchor the narrative in a domestic, ordinary world and make the loss feel uniquely personal. At the same time, those domestic details are public facts that investigators must weigh. In Ginny's case, Alvin's hearing of a car door slam is a public, documented element. Violet's memory of seeing Ginny stepping out of the house crying is likewise recorded. These small facts are especially important because they steer official thinking toward foul play rather than runaway or misadventure. The assault of time can erode memories, but the parts that remain are often the most vivid. The sharpness of an argument, the sudden cold, the silence after someone walks away. For decades, the Sampare family kept telling their story to anyone who would listen. Reporters, local community meetings, and eventually the national inquiry. Each telling laid down another layer of testimony, and each time the family spoke, they asked two things: that the public remember Ginny as a person, and that authorities not let her case be forgotten. The way they framed their appeals was not theatrical, it was matter-of-fact and weary. They asked for access to files, for fresh eyes on old evidence, and for a recognition that a missing Indigenous woman deserved the same vigor in investigation as any community member. Those requests echo across many similar cases, and they are one of the reasons the national inquiry became necessary. To collect these testimonies and build a larger record that could underpin systemic reform. It is tempting to think that modern technology will solve old mysteries. DNA databases have solved some cold cases. New forensic techniques have exonerated the innocent and convicted the guilty. But technology alone is not a magic wand. In cases like Ginny's, where the trail goes cold almost immediately, technology must be applied to materials that exist: physical evidence, human remains, verified sightings. Without those, DNA has nothing to match. Forensic analysis has nothing to analyze. What families want is not only the best science, but also the attention and investigative continuity that will search for overlooked evidence, re-interview witnesses, and follow leads with the urgency a living person's disappearance deserves. That dual requirement, science plus sustained investigative work, is the real need behind every plea for cold case review. Think of the way small communities move through loss. In places like Gitsagukla, where families are intertwined and everyone knows someone who knows someone, loss becomes a shared experience. That collective memory has kept Ginny's name alive. Local media pieces, online memorials, and advocacy organizations regularly list her among those still missing. The effect is not to sensationalize, but to keep a moral ledger. She was here, she was loved, and we are still looking. For listeners far from northern British Columbia, that ledger can be a bridge, a way to feel the real human consequence of policy failures and investigative lapses. To read through the National Inquiry transcripts or to hear Rod speak is to be offered a close-up of grief lived over years, not in a single moment. If you want to understand what it feels like for a family to live with unanswered loss, imagine pausing life every year on the date someone was last seen, not out of ritual, but because that pause is how time organizes itself around a rupture. For Ginny's siblings, anniversaries do that work. They mark the year. They call forth memory. They are a time to renew the request for answers. That renewed appeal led to more public telling, to interviews with journalists, and eventually to the family's appearance before the inquiry in 2017. Those hearings are not simply bureaucratic checkpoints, they are public acts of bearing, witness, and they matter, because they turn private grief into a record that a nation can read and, ideally, respond to. Decades of not knowing consolidate into a different kind of knowledge. The knowledge that the missing are still missing and that systems have failed in identifiable ways. The National Inquiry catalogued many such failures: indifference, delayed action, lack of cultural competency, and placed them in a context larger than any single case. For the Sampare family, this official attention was a form of recognition. It did not solve everything, but recognition matters. It admits that the absence is not the family's private shame or failure, that the missing person was not invisible to history. Ginny lived. She had relationships, jobs, hopes. To call her merely a case without that human detail would be to distort everything. The inquiry's records keep those human details in the public sphere. What, then, is left to say about the night of October 14th, 1971? The hard facts are few and precise. Jean Virginia Sampare, also called Ginny, born September 10th, 1953, was last seen that night near a railway overpass on Highway 16 outside Gitsagukla, British Columbia. Her cousin Alvin left momentarily and later reported hearing a vehicle door close. When he returned, Ginny was gone. A missing persons report was filed 2 days later. Searches continued for nearly 2 weeks before they were called off. The RCMP closed the case in 1985, citing a local report that she had drowned, though there is no conclusive public evidence to prove this. DNA from her siblings was taken around 2006, but has not been publicly tied to any resolution. Her family continued to press for answers, speaking to media and testifying at the National Inquiry in 2017. Those facts form the spine of the story. Around them live memories, suspicion, institutional friction, and a long human demand for truth. And yet, for all the official traces and recorded testimony, the most profound part of this story is not the chronology, but the silence. Silence here is not absence of sound, but the active persistence of not knowing. It is the silence at the end of a walk when the person who should meet you is not there. It is the silence of a family that learned to live with a missing place at their table. It is the silence that occurs when authorities close a file and declare a conclusion that the family does not accept. This silence is both cruel and stubborn. It refuses to be filled by rumor or by unverified claims. The family's insistence on truth is a way of refusing to let silence speak for them. There is a twist to this kind of sorrow that is both everyday and searing. Families of the missing often become teachers because they must explain their lives to outsiders again and again, journalists, police, inquests. They learn to translate private grief into public language. Rod and Winnie's public words about Ginny have taught many people about the consequences of indifferent investigations and about the lived realities of Northern Indigenous communities. Their testimony has shaped public understanding in ways that no single news article ever could. That is part of the emotional twist of this story. From unbearable personal loss has come not only continued searching, but also a form of public education, a stubborn insistence that memory be turned into policy. In resisting erasure, the family has opened a space for others to learn and to act. If you are listening to this story, let this be the clearest and simplest of requests. Remember the person who was lost. Remember Ginny, not as an emblem or an item in a list, but as a sister who was supposed to move to Terrace, who worked at a canning plant, who went outside one October night crying and never came back. Remember Alvin's account of hearing a car. Dr. Slam, remember her family's long push for access to records and for the case to be treated with the seriousness it deserved. These are the facts that anchor the story to reality and give shape to the grief that came after. They are not the end of the story, but they are a necessary place to stand when we ask what justice would look like for someone like Virginia Sampare. There are no neat endings here. There is no courtroom verdict that ties up the threads. Instead, there is the long, patient work of family memory, the periodic flare of public interest, and the incremental policy changes that come from national attention to the larger issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Ginny's case is one among many that together reveal structural problems and invite specific remedies, improved policing practices, better record-keeping, freely available files to families, and culturally informed approaches to investigation and victim support. Those are the kinds of reforms that would have helped Ginny's family then, and that might prevent similar heartbreak for others now. The work is slow and institutional, but it also matters deeply on the ground where families live and grieve. In the end, the emotional twist is not a twist of plot, but of perspective. For many listeners, a missing person case like Ginny's might seem fast-moving and resolvable in a sensational moment. For her family, the long stretch of not knowing has been the real shape of the story. In that long stretch, the family has done something profound. They transformed private grief into public testimony. They insisted that memory be recorded, and they refused to let their sister's life be reduced to a file in a basement. That insistence is not only a demand for justice, it is an act of love that keeps a human being present in the world. It is also a challenge to us, listeners, neighbors, officials, to carry those names forward with care and with the commitment to turn attention into action. So when you think of Jean Virginia Sampare, let it be with the fullness of what we know and the humility of what we do not. Know the facts that have been documented. Her birth in 1953, the last night in October 1971 by Highway 16, Alvin's account, the searches that were called off, the RCMP's later actions, the family's refusal to accept administrative closure, and their testimony to a national inquiry. Know, too, that beyond those facts lies a life, a sister, an employee, a young woman with plans, and a family that has spent generations carrying her absence. In honoring those realities, we do something, small but important. We refuse to let a life be nothing more than a missing case. We keep the person alive in memory and in demand for justice. If someday a new piece of evidence appears, it will have to live up to the careful standards this case has taught us to require. Proof stronger than rumor, documentation sharper than memory alone. Until then, the Sampare family holds the story, telling it to anyone who will listen, insisting that their sister's absence be treated as the urgent, unsolved human story it is. Their persistence is not merely about answers, it is about dignity. It is about refusing the erasure that comes when institutions treat missing Indigenous women as less than everyone else. That insistence has reshaped the conversation around the Highway of Tears and has pushed national institutions to reckon with decades of neglect. For Ginny and for her family, the search continues, not because they hope for a tidy ending, but because justice, when it comes, must be the result. Of truth, not of silence. Remember her name, Jean Virginia Sampare. Remember that a cold October night, a slammed car door and a jacket left hanging became an absence her family has lived with for generations. Remember, too, that memory can be a form of power. Power to demand records, to insist on inquiries, and to make sure a missing person does not become invisible to history. This is not a tidy story with a resolved finale. It is a calling, a call to listen, to remember, and to act so that other families will not have to live the same quiet, aching years of not knowing.